In this video, I want to present to you a type of component for development in Python Web together with Vue.js. So Vue.js has its own components, but what we're going to do here is a component that spans both the browser and the server. Normal Vue components are only on the browser. So let me draw a diagram to show you what is going on. This is the browser. And this is the server. Okay, so think about implementing something that can store data or fetch data. For example, we will develop star rating components that can read how many stars something has received, display them, and enable you to modify the star rating of something. And we will also develop forms that will enable you to insert, edit, or view content from a database or from any other source actually. So when you implement one of these type of things, there is a server component that needs to sit in the server and prepare the data and send it to the browser, and a browser component that needs to display the data in a Vue template that is reusable so that you can use any number of these components in the browser. So essentially, if we want to develop a component that has a piece of it sitting in the browser and a piece of it sitting in the server. This component will be standardized, and to specify the specific behavior on the server in which you actually are going to fetch the data and process the data once you get answers back from the browser, you will subclass it, adding a particular instructions to it. Okay, so you will modify some small portions of the server component in any actual use in which you explain actually where to get the data and what to do with the answers that come from the browser. In the browser, you typically use the component as is without any changes. You can use it once or multiple times, and there will be communication between the browser and server that is implemented. So the piece that you really have to do, the part that you have to worry about when using these components is this one. So this is what you write. Okay, and the rest is part of the component. So the beauty of these components is that they are reusable. You can, for example, if you have many star ratings to ask for in the browser, you can just insert the component multiple times with each time with only one line of code. And you specialize it in the server via simple Python subclassing, and you don't have to worry about building the connection between the component in the browser and the one in the server. It's actually built for you as part of the component. So this is the goal, and I'm gonna show you how it is implemented. Let me give you a demo of the star rating component first. You can find it in the examples app that comes along with the Python Web. As of the recording of this video, this is in a pull request, but as you will listen to this video, this will be probably already in the normal branch of Python Web. Okay, the examples app contains many examples of applications, and this is one of them. So if you go into the menu, you will see that there is a star rating component in Vue using Bulma CSS. So we can click on these and see how it works. Okay, so this is what we see. We see that there are three star rating components. So there are three instances of the component running in the browser. And in fact, if we look at the network tab just quickly, we see that there are three get statements, three get communications that get essentially the number of stars for each one of these components. We can examine one of them if we like. And if we look at the response, sorry, this is a bit small. We see that the num stars is equal to 0 for each one of these requests. Okay, you can also look at the raw form. What we're transmitting back is JSON. Okay, so maybe it's more readable this way. Okay, so each one of our get statements has a num stars of 0. So each component talks independently to the backend, each component instance, and gets the information it needs. And when you do an action over the component, you see this reacts as a normal star rater. When you do an action on it, suppose I fix 4 stars for these, there will be a post. Okay, is written very small, but this is I cannot even enlarge it. This is a post request. The response is okay, but the request would say that the number of stars of this component is 4, and you wonder which component. Well, is written here, the component number 2, Z1, 2, 3, right? If we do 2 stars for the component number 3, click, we see that on the component number 3 there will be 2 stars. Okay, so you can see that we can instantiate the component in the browser multiple times, and on the server these will communicate with the component, and so we will have to write on the server 2 pieces of code. One to fetch the number of stars when the component is first instantiated, and second, another piece of code that explains what to do with the ratings once they come from the browser. Okay, so those are the 2 pieces of code. So now let's take a look at how this is implemented in code. Now let's look at the implementation. First of all, where are the files of the implementation? So we are in the examples app, and there is a server portion of the component and a browser portion. The server portion is in this folder called components. For the star rater, it will be here, starrater.py. Here you can find also some other components. For the browser portion, things we serve to the browser are always going to be in the static folder. So they're going to be in static, components Bulma, star rater, and here you can find the CSS, the template HTML, and the JavaScript. So that's where the files are. Let us start looking at how this is implemented in the controller, which is in controller components.py, which is here. So this is how we use this component. There is a class star rater given to us, and we have to specialize it, telling it how to read the stars of the objects at the beginning when the objects are loaded. This is the initial star rating we will display, and how to set the stars if a user changes any star rating. So here I subclass the star rater component into a my star rater. And then I do the following. For get stars, I write some fake code here. So here I return the post ID modulo 6, just for the fun of it, so that I will have different number of stars. In reality, you typically read these from a database. In the set stars method, I simply print out the number of stars. Okay, so this is like a very simple implementation just for this, for the sake of this example. This gives me my star rater class, which I instantiate into an object. I need to pass it to the session as well. Okay, you find these parameters in the parameters of the original class. And then I have 2 methods here. I have, the method that generates the Vue page in which the component will be used. This is kind of normal. And then you have the method that essentially returns to the web page the list of posts. I generate an artificial list of 3 posts, and then for each post I fix its stars callback URL. This is the callback URL that the star rater will be using to do the get and the post of the number of stars. So the star rater is kind enough to tell me which callback URL to use in order to talk to it. I say starrater.url and I pass the post ID, and this will give me an appropriate URL for that post ID. Okay, so this is the server portion. If you look at how the page is implemented, it's done in this way. The core is this is a Vue template. You see that it contains a loop for posting all the posts. Okay, and it displays the post content, and below it includes a star rater that talks back to the post stars callback URL. So if we run this code, I just rerun it for the fun of it, just to make sure that I'm running the current code. And if I reload this page, you see 1, 2, 3. I toyed a bit with the code to give you something interesting. So when the page asks for the number of posts via these, the star rater has its own callback URL. When the page asks for the number of stars, it gets 1, 2, and 3. Okay, and if I now change this to 4, you know there is this post request in which I say that the number of stars is 4, and here it prints out the number of stars of item 1 is set to 4. So this is what is printed out by this, by the setStars method. Very good. So what remains to be done is to show, this shows you how the component is used, and what remains to be done is how to show you the code of the component itself. The HTML template of the star rater is quite similar to the star rating code we have already seen in our prior lectures on Vue.js. So this is again, we have the mouse over events and the mouse out events and click events. We'll iterate over the stars and we display them as filled or empty, as in the previous case. The star rater JavaScript is somewhat straightforward if you look at it. What you see is that I set, it has a property URL, okay, and I set it to be the callback URL. So this property URL is the property that you see used here. So this essentially tells every particular instance of the star rater what is its callback URL. And so, in every instance of the star rater, you have this property URL that can be set each time the component is instantiated. Okay, so this callback URL is used in two places, as you can see here. When you load the component, you do an Axios get to the callback URL because you want to fetch the initial number of stars, and you fetch it and you set it here, number of stars assigned and to display. And when somebody sets the stars, you send back to the server via the callback URL via post this time the new number of stars. So notice we use the same callback URL both for getting and for putting the number of stars, and the two events are distinguished because in one case we do a get when we need to read the number of stars, and in the other case we do a post. So this is the rest of the component is similar with the methods stars over, stars out to what we have done before. And the only interesting piece happens at the very end. We use this queue.register Vue component. This is essentially, this queue is a library that comes with a Python web to facilitate various things, including the use of Vue components. And so we say that we want to register a Vue component that is called star rater. This is the name that will be used here, to use it. So we are saying essentially, please create a component with a tag name star rater. The template will come from this file, and is set here, and what we wrote above is the code of the star rating component. Okay, so this is what essentially finishes up the creation of the component and ties its template to its JavaScript behavior. It's convenient because it's much nicer to be able to write a JavaScript and template in different places. At last, let us look at the server portion of the star rater. It is instantiated by passing it a path, a session, and possibly some other parameters. The path will be used for all the callbacks. I have to define in a static way what is the prefix that I will use to call the star rater. If you look at our controller, you see that when I instantiated the star rater, I pass it a star rater path. This is arbitrary. It's up to you to check that it does not clash with any other paths of your application. You see, for example, this is star rater, Vue Bulma is another path. This string here has to be different from all the other strings. You could generate it at random if you wanted, but it has to be a separate string. So the star rater takes the path and the session, and the initialization method, what it does is this. It says that the session and the signer, if you specify one, are part of the prerequisites. In fact, the signer is there by default. Okay. Moreover, it says the following, that you see, it has to register the callback to get stars and to set stars. So it has to essentially say, hey, when the web server receives a call to certain paths, I have to use set stars and get stars. And so you're used to seeing this action decorator used as a decorator, but you can use it also in this way. What is this line is saying is essentially the equivalent, if you will, for a moment, of this piece of code. Then I will delete it, but it's the same as action.uses. You would be familiar with it, seeing it this way. Action.uses, in this case of args, because and then I want to say above it action path plus id method is equal to get. Okay, so this is what you would expect essentially, and then you would see def set stars, for instance. Well, get stars. So these three lines are the way in which you so far are used to seeing declared endpoints. But here we have to declare an endpoint inside the initializer. So we do these same three lines in this way. We say f is equal to the result of saying, from inside out, we take the method selfGetStars and we wrap it around the action uses decorator. So this first line does the equivalent of this wrapping, right? We get stars and we wrap it inside action uses. We get stars and we wrap it around the action uses. The second line does the equivalent. You see, we get the result f and we plug it back in. So the second line does the equivalent of this other decorator, which essentially wraps around the result into an action call for a certain path. So this declares the action uses and this declares the path for the endpoint. Okay? So these three lines, I just introduced them to you to explain what is going on. So let me remove them and put back the code in the way it was. Okay? So this is the initialization code, essentially records these two endpoints. The call method, we are not gonna use it here. We use it in an explicit way. But the URL method returns the callback URL to self-path, ID, and signed. The getStars method, normally you wanna override it, and the setStars method, normally you wanna override it as well. These are the two methods that give you the spatial behavior of a star rating component in each particular application, and in fact we have overridden them here. Okay? So this is what there is to it. That's the whole implementation. Now this is a lot of fun, but let us see some other components. Let's look at this example, which is a demonstration of grid and forms. So we see a grid here. This is entirely generated by JavaScript. For every row, you can sort it or unsort it. You can also, for every row, view it. It contains more information. This gives you a view form. Okay, and you can also edit it, in which case you can edit and say like hello there. And notice that the beauty of these forms is that they are location aware. Because the browser knows your time zone, these times are converted between UTC on the server to your local time zone on the client. You are told which time zone you are in, so that there is no ambiguity about the time and date that is being chosen. Okay, this is I did it because I was incredibly frustrated with all these web interfaces in which you have to select 6:09 a.m. and it doesn't tell you then in which time zone it will interpret your time, and maybe you are traveling for that day, you are in a different time zone and you are setting all the events at the wrong time. So you can say 8 a.m. You see, this passes in quite a liberal form what you're saying. It has understood it. You see, it gives you for confirmation the time and date. This is a date picker, nothing very special about it. But also notice here that every time you change data, the server is consulted to do data validation. So data validation occurs both in the client. For example, if I say like potatoes, it will tell me that it's unable to parse it in invalid format, right? And if I fix it again, you see it valid. So there is a JavaScript validation step, but then I also consulted the server so that you can write a completely arbitrary validation on the server that works seamlessly with the browser for these forms. Okay, and so these pull down lists work, everything normally works. Okay, you can save the changes, and this grid is again done completely in JavaScript. So here I have a grid and edit and view and also insert forms. This would be the insert form that work perfectly one with the other. And I want to show you how it is done because it's really quite simple. So let's look at the code for doing this. I will have to generate a grid and the insert, edit and view forms. Let me get to the forms first, if you don't mind. So the forms are done here. So I have a VuForm class, which is defined, as you now know, in examples vuform.py. Okay, so here would be the code. We can get to the code later. But I instantiate it into a view form, into an insert form, and into an edit form. And you see that the main difference between these forms are that I need to give instantiations for these read values method and process post. Essentially, what distinguishes a form from another is where do you read the values from and what do you do with the data once the data comes back from the browser. So you see, for example, for the insert form, this is a bit of boilerplate code that you can reuse. That essentially says, take all the fields of a table and just say that, they have no value. You use a formatter for none to give it a nice format. The process post, when the user clicks on submit to insert, you simply say self database VuForm table. This is a table I'm using. I defined a database table. I can show it to you. It's here in models as usual. It's this table here. You see, this first name, last name, read animal, arrival time. This is the table we are using here. So I say selfdb that table insert the dictionary of values. So this will insert a new data. In the case of edit form, I do an update, as you might imagine, for the process post. It contains an update for the correct record ID. And for the edit form, instead of reading empty values, as I was doing here, for the insert form, for the edit form, in the read values, I will actually read the real values from the table. You see, I select the table with the appropriate ID, and then I will read the values and format them properly and pass it to the instance in the browser. Okay, so essentially when you want to use one of these forms, these are the two methods to specialize: read values and process post. Another tiny difference is that you see that these methods, read values and process post, use a record ID. So you have to essentially specify whether you are using an ID or not. For the edit form, you need to say use ID is equal to true, and then this record ID will be populated in the proper way. And for the insert form, you don't say that, and the record ID in fact is disregarded. It will be none. Things are similar for the grid. The code is a bit longer though, because we need to specify in detail everything that should appear in this grid. And so what we do is as follows. We specialize a grid class, and what we do is we redefine essentially the API method. Okay, the initialization only contains some information about which fields are sortable, which in this case are these three fields. Okay, but otherwise the API method is in charge of returning a grid, so the content of the table, in response to a request. And so what we do is this: we have to define, what the header is of the table. We query the database, and based on the rows that are the result of the queries, we form the cells of the table, and we return the cells of the table. Okay, I'm going a bit fast, but you can read the details by yourself. They are not so incredibly esoteric. It's only that we have in detail to build all the cells of the table in the way we want. See, for example, we append a cell that has as content the row first name as text. And so this will be, Luca, George, Jane, etc., etc. And here is a bit more interesting. We build a cell that contains the arrival time, and we say type is equal to date. This will tell the JavaScript to convert these into the local time zone of the user. Actually, it's doing a bad job here. I think we could improve the JavaScript, but we shall do that later. Okay, and so these are the various conversions. This is where you produce the various cells, and then you ship back a dictionary containing the page, which is, we are on page 1, there is no next page in the pagination. You say which page you have been able to get. Should you show the search bar? What is a placeholder for the search bar? Do I have more pages? So that should the pagination show that I have more pages, and what the rows of the table are. Okay, so this is the definition of my grid. Okay, and then I use these objects in controllers in a way that is actually quite concise. For example, let's look at where I use the insert form. I instantiate it, and then I say the insert form Vue controller, the one that will display the insert form, is done in this way. I pass it a form that is the insert form in which I specify a specific cancel URL. And if I look at insert form HTML to see what's going on there, it's one of my templates, insert form HTML, this one. What I do is that I simply write form. So in a way, it couldn't be any easier to actually use one of these forms. Okay? And internally, the code for a form is slightly complicated. I can show it to you with a warning that you have to read it patiently on your own to understand it. So the code for a form contains, is a little bit longer. It has various options, and then it contains a lot of code that is given to transforming the information as it is in the database with the information as it is expected by JavaScript, and to do all the possible validations. So the code in this case is a little bit longer than for the star rater, but the principle is the same. This is code that takes care of all the boring part, and by specializing the way you get the data and you write it back, you can obtain a form that is tuned to updating the table you want or doing whatever you want. Okay? Equally for the JavaScript of the form is also slightly more sophisticated, obviously, than the JavaScript for the star rater. We can give it a glimpse without looking at it, really. You see, it's a longer file. In this case, I sometimes evolve it, but it's about 200 lines of code. It's basically dealing with a lot of validation and formatting and interpreting the times you're writing and so on and so forth. So this is a general principle. And I leave the inspection of the code details to you.